Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar integrating REST APIs for data visualization in JavaScript apps. With us as usual is Casey McGuigan, our product manager for Reveal, and of course my name is Jason Barris, Senior VP of Developer Tools here at Infragistics. So today's agenda, pretty cool stuff. We're going to look at Reveal data sources and then how do we use REST APIs with Reveal. We're going to see probably something most of you have never seen, how to configure a JSON endpoint, which will allow you to skip those intermediate screens where you go right from a data source item right into the editor. Usually with REST, you don't do that. There's a couple intermediate screens that you have to select the data source item, then you jump into the editor. Well, you're going to see today how you can do a little configuration there to make it cooler. We're going to look at passing parameters in headers. We're basically going to build most of this from scratch from the docs. And so you're going to see where to find things in the docs, how to apply it in real life, and where to look for resources as well, like on GitHub. Quick housekeeping, recording and slides will be available after the webinar. Please ask questions in the Q&A window and make sure you hit to everyone so we all see your question and I or someone else will answer. So, Reveal data sources. Currently, we're always adding new data sources in Reveal, but currently we have 34 native data sources with MongoDB coming soon. That will ship hopefully in about 3 weeks, maybe 4. I think October 20th is our next Reveal release, and MongoDB will be shipping in that release. And when I say native data sources, what we do is we ship data sources in .NET, Java, and Node.js. Most of our code starts in C#. We have some internal technology we've built over the last 10 years that translates it to Java, and then we wrap .NET Core in Node.js, so it basically will run on any platform like Linux and Mac and all that stuff. I use ARM Windows on a Mac and .NET Core, and it works perfect. Of course, Java works perfect, and Node works perfect everywhere. So it's quite nice, actually. But I wanted to highlight that at Infragistics, 100% of our data sources are created by the Reveal team. So if you're like, why don't you have like 300 data sources like Power BI? It's because we build our own data sources to work perfectly with Reveal. We're not looking for like the latest ODBC driver from some company, then trying to fix it and fill it within our application. We actually build these from scratch. Some of them, like Oracle and others, have some proprietary assemblies that we use from those vendors, but everything really is built by us. So if there's a bug in a data source or you need a capability, we can actually add that capability because we own the code and we do everything with these data sources. One thing to remember is if you haven't looked at version 1.6 yet, which released about 3-4 weeks ago, we've decoupled the data sources from the core Reveal engine. So now in NuGet or Node, actually really right now it's just in .NET Core. So in Java and Node, they're all still coupled with the core Reveal library. But for .NET Core, you have to install different NuGet packages based on the data sources that you're using. For today, since we are using REST and JSON, we don't have to do anything special. Those are just natively part of the core Reveal API, so you don't have to install anything special. There's videos up on YouTube, and we did a video a few weeks ago that shows how to use all the other data sources or how to actually add a data source, register a data source. If you need help on that, post something in the chat or shoot me an email, and I will get you going on the right path. So for REST endpoints and web resources, what you have to remember is if there's a data source that we don't have a connection to, like I think we added Marketo sometime last year. Well, if you didn't have if you were using Marketo before and you wanted to use it in Reveal, but we didn't have a native Marketo data source, you could use Marketo's REST API interface and still use Marketo data inside of Reveal. And I'm telling you, most of the SaaS apps out there have REST endpoints which are available to you. So even if we don't have a native connector, there's still the option for you to use the REST endpoint of that data provider. So always think that way when you're looking at data sources, like even Databricks, Cosmos DB, they all have REST endpoints. So you can say Cosmos DB, make this available as a REST endpoint, and you could use Cosmos with Reveal. Now, here's what you have to remember when you're working with REST. Nothing's happening on the database server. There's no database server. It's just an endpoint. So all of the work is done by the Reveal engine on your application server. You have to make sure that you are doing what's best for performance for the number of users that you have and the size of your payloads, because we've run into this before with customers where their payloads are huge and they have a ton of users, and the app server just can't keep up. And the way that Reveal does caching really does help, but if you don't want to use caching, then you'll further degrade performance. So I just caution using REST as your total solution when you have large payloads coming down to the client. If your payloads aren't that big, you probably won't notice a difference. But the big time consuming piece of this, well, that's interesting. The big time consuming piece of this is downloading that data, and then we parse that data, so that takes maybe 2 seconds, 4 seconds, and then we're doing calculations. Those calculations probably happen quick, but you start to multiply that by all the visualizations that you might have, all the users hitting your server. So just be careful when you're using REST. And if you notice in the doc something called a web resource is like this umbrella data source that we use. And inside of the web resource, you have CSV, XLSX, XLX, JSON, etc. These allow you to really just have any type of endpoint in that web resource. And I'm going to show you how that works today. We're going to create a web resource, and then for the JSON data source item, it's going to use the web resource data source item so we know what to do with it. And then we're going to pass a configuration to it to render your data. So let's go ahead and take a look at a demo and see how all of this works. Okay, so first let's start out in the docs. I am over here at help.revealbi.io. Normally when you go to the help docs, you end up at this page. I scrolled all the way down and I went to data sources, then I clicked into REST. So here is where we're going to start with this coding today. The other place that you can start is if you go over to GitHub, samples SDK JavaScript, and you go to data sources. You can see here there is sample code for various data sources. There's REST service. So if you click on REST service, you'll see there's an index.html. And if you go to JSON, there's JSON, and then Excel file and CSV. If you remember, I mentioned the web resource item. That's where you would use these various different files. The other thing that I want to highlight, since we're over here at Reveal BI on GitHub, is if you look at the Reveal SDK repository and you go over to issues, this is where you can see issues, post issues, see the progress of issues. It's really important that you're aware of where to get this information, because people will want to know, hey, I asked for a feature request. Well, this is where you can find out the status of your feature request. And it's really up to you to post here. So if we post here on behalf of you, you'll never get a notification or update. If you post here, you will get the notification and the updates as status goes along. But this is important. And then, of course, I always try to mention SDK samples JavaScript because it has all the goodies here. But if we go back to the documentation, let's start here for how we're going to build out this app. So you can see this is adding a REST data source. It's telling us a couple things. We need to add an event handler for the reveal view.onDataSourceRequested. This is standard stuff if you've ever used the product. And then here we will add the RV REST data source object, which will point to the URL that has the data that we're looking for. So let's go ahead and copy this. And I have Visual Studio Code open. Here I've got mostly an empty HTML page. I do have my reveal view set up already. Remember, the reveal view is just a div, and that div is where you are placing your dashboard file, or in this case, we are actually going to start in edit mode for this particular sample. So what we usually do here is we have our reveal view, and then the next thing we would do is we would say reveal view dot, and then what do we want to do? We want to start in edit mode equals true, like so. And now this will start in edit mode, which means we won't be loading a dashboard by default. So in the on data source requested, what do we need to add here? Well, this is where we're going to go back to the docs, and we are going to copy this code here, which is our REST data source. So we want to give it a title, a subtitle, an endpoint, anonymous authentication equals true, and then we'll add it to our array here. So let's go back, and I will paste this right in here, and I'm going to get rid of this duplicate code. We already have this statement up here, so let's clean that up. And then we already have our callback. Well, we'll just delete what we already did because this has REST data source already. So I've got my reveal view pointing to reveal view, which is up here, which is my div. I'm telling it to start in edit mode. And then in my on data source requested event, I'm creating an RV REST data source, which is a REST endpoint called sales by category. XL2 JSON happens to be where this endpoint lives. I'm giving it a URL, and anonymous authentication equals true. And before we run this, I'm going to change this to sales by category demo. Just you'll see why in a minute. So let's go ahead and view this in our default browser, and you'll see we started in edit mode. Everything looks good. I'll click plus visualization. I have sales by category demo, and you'll notice that it says verification failed error. Now, why is that? Well, what we don't have anywhere is a server running. So you'll notice I do have a server here called the Reveal REST server, but nothing's running on my local client. However, I can use the default sample server that we always have up and running. So let's go ahead and paste in that URL and see what the difference is. So we'll go back down to our client, and I am going to add one line of code here for our Reveal SDK settings. And if you've seen demos before, I use this where we have like the marketing dashboard, the sales dashboard, etc. So we're basically just pointing to a Reveal server that's running up in the cloud. Now let's run this guy again. We'll do plus visualization, and we will say continue. Just it's giving us that default file. I have my table, my suggested table from the REST endpoint. I'll go ahead and do a load data. And what we can do is let's just do a grid here, and I'll say category name, product name, and you can see that we're getting data back from the server. So you're probably thinking, wait a minute, you didn't write any code on the server. That's correct. We didn't have to write any code on the server because one unique aspect of the REST data sources and the JSON data sources is that you can do them 100% client side, which you are probably thinking, wait a minute, is that safe? Probably not. However, it is possible. So you can do 100% of your code client side in terms of what the endpoint is and then what shows up when you go to create a visualization. However, we're going to change that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this REST data source URL, and that's going to go away. And if you remember here, I had this title, sales by category demo. So what I want to do now is I actually want to change my server. So I'm going to change this to my local server. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this whole line. I'm going to paste this in. Whoops, we'll comment this out just in case we need it again. And I'm going to say localhost, and this will probably be 7600, I think. That's what my .NET server is here. So I have a .NET Core server running. I have the basic functions here that you need. You need a data source provider, user context provider, authentication provider. We're going to talk about all of these in a bit. But the first thing we're going to do is set up our data source item and change data source async. As you know, since version 1.3 or 1.4, we always want to make sure that in the change data source item async, you are calling change data source async, and then you're passing the user context. So here I'm going to pass the user context, and I'm going to pass the data source that's getting passed in this case, the RV dashboard data source. And if we scroll to the right, we'll see we've got the RV data source item, or it's called data source item. So I'm going to pass in the data source item dot data source. And that is what I am passing or making sure gets changed or checked every time we do a change data source item async. Now, with REST, you're not really working with data source items, you're just working with data sources because each one is sort of like its own table. So what you're going to end up doing here, and I'll just take some defaults here and we'll just type this out. I'm going to say if the data source is, and what does it need to be, an RV REST, and you can see that we've got all of the various data source options here. But if I want to say if this is an RV REST data source, and we'll call it REST DS, then what do I want to do? I'm going to say if REST DS dot what? ID, title, we can call it whatever we want, equals, in this case, I think we're just going to call it category, and we'll make sure here if I go to this, I'm going to do an ID, so we'll do REST data source dot ID equals category. So all we need to do is make sure that these match up. So if this on the client says category, the ID, I want to use that ID on the server. So let's go back here. So if the ID equals category, what do I want to do? I'm going to say REST DS dot URL, and no, it shouldn't be string dot empty. It actually needs to be that same endpoint that we were using before. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. So let's do that. We'll do a paste and that. And that's all we need to do. So now instead of this being set on the client, I'm actually setting it on the server. So if the incoming ID is going to be category, I could have said title, subtitle, anything. I just need to make sure that something matches. So now I'll go ahead and run this guy. And now my server will start. So this is my own local server, not the one up in the cloud. And you can see it is HPS 7006. Now let's go here. We said HTTP localhost 7006. I have category. So let's run this in the browser. We'll click plus visualization. We have sales by category demo. And we have verification failed. That usually happens because there's going to be an error in something I did here. So we've got our REST data source title up. This is one problem. ID should be lowercase. And then I believe I typed that wrong. That should be 7006, which I think I looked at twice. And this is live coding here, folks. So there we go. Right click, view in browser. And let's plus visualization, sales by category. I'm going to hit continue. And then you can see I do have my table. If I select this, we'll get a preview of the data in my table. And I'll load the data. And here we are with product name. And we'll do product sales. And we have now product sales. And we'll change this instead of sum. Let's do the average sales by product. And looks beautiful. We could change the title, get rid of the legend, etc. But there you go. It's that easy to connect your REST data source to a Reveal server. But let's do something a little richer right now. So what I'm going to do to avoid any further typos is I am going to do a little copy paste. Let me go ahead and delete. I'm going to delete everything in my script tag. And I'm going to go over to my all this good stuff. Control C. And I'm going to paste this right in. And you will notice the code is the same, except I have 3 REST data sources here. And what I'm going to do is in my array for REST data sources, I'll do REST 1, comma REST 2, comma rest3. And as you know, this is how we populate that dialog, which gives you each one of these items in the list. I have sales by category, I have orders, and I have customer orders. And in the same vein, I am going to copy some code here, and I'm going to spruce up this code here. So on the change data source async, I want to add 3 if statements for the incoming data sources, my orders, my sales by category, and then my customer orders. But you'll notice customer orders is a little bit different because this is a parameterized query up on Northwind. So my Northwind cloud server, it's in Azure. I'm passing in the user context.user ID. So imagine someone logged into your server and this user, it needs to be passed as a parameter so they only see certain data. That's what this is all about. So how does that actually work? Well, in your user context provider, you've got the get user context. So what we can do on the client side is pass additional headers. It's actually called pass additional headers to the server. And in this case, I'm passing an additional header called xHeader1, and I want to retrieve the value of that. And if it happens to be empty, I want to hard code elfkey. So we're going to see how I wire that up in the client in a little bit, but I am not going to touch this. This is ready to go. Our data source provider is ready to go. I have 2 endpoints here, orders and sales by category. Note that I'm looking for title, not ID in this guy. So if I run this, we are back to the same Swagger definition here, all of my endpoints. If I go back to VS Code, I've got my SDK settings pointing to my server. I've got 3 REST endpoints, and I'm passing those to the callback. If I right click, open this in my default browser, I'll do plus visualization, click sales by category, and there's my sales by category. I'll select this. It gives me my table. Let's load this up, and we will do category name and product sales, and there we go. It's that easy to do a dashboard with REST. I mean, it doesn't get much easier than this. I'll discard this plus visualization. We'll do orders. So this is the orders query, a completely different endpoint. It has a bunch more data in it, so it might take another second to download. And again, this is my free Azure tier, so it's always going to be a little bit slower. So let's hit continue. It brings me to my suggested table. And then here, for example, let's do freight by country. I'll do freight by country, like so. Looks great, and there's my chart, and I could do all kinds of other things here if I would like to. Maybe I'll do a category of ship region, and we got a lot of different regions here. Why don't we change this to a stacked chart, and now you can see all of the information based on region and shipping. So looks great, and that's again how simple it is to get going. Now, remember we had our customer orders, which was expecting a parameter. Well, in this case, I would only expect elfkey because I'm not passing any extra headers in. So if I go to a grid and I look at what data is actually coming back, it's only the elfkey data. So this was hard-coded, and that REST data endpoint here ended up constructing this whole query. So if I set a breakpoint right there, or actually no, we'll just set the breakpoint here, and let's go back to our browser. We'll close this out, discard, plus visualization, customer orders. Okay, so now we hit here. Let's go down one more. What is my REST DS URL? You can see that it made it into elfkey. So if I right click, copy this, we'll go to the browser and we'll paste this guy in. You can see what data we should expect back for elfkey. So it works exactly like you would have expected, but how do you pass the correct header to this endpoint so it does more than just elfkey? Well, let's do that real quick. So let's minimize this. Let's go back to our client. We don't have to change our server. All of this is going to happen on the client. So I again have some handy code here that I am going to just copy paste. So the first thing that I want to do is add a select, and that select is going to have some various customer IDs. What I'm essentially doing here is faking that this is the person that's logged in. And of course, I have a default here for select a customer, which would then be, hey, there was nothing there. It's empty. The value is empty. So force it to be Alfkey by default. And you might say force it to be nothing, return an error. That's really up to you. But here's the magic code that makes all of this work. And we're just going to paste it in right here. What this is doing here is pulling in whatever I've selected in the customer select, and I'm passing it off to this set additional headers provider callback, which is part of the reveal API. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, set some additional headers to this URL in whatever is in this headers array. Now, what I need to do is modify this a little bit. So I need to cut this. We'll do a Control X, and I need to actually have this code happen inside the callback because I want to make sure every time something is selected that the right variable is passed from my selected item. And I also need to make sure that headers is available to this guy. So we're going to remove this, and I'm just going to up here var headers equals like so. I think that's it. So we've got our function being passed to here. I'm returning my headers, and my headers value is getting the selected item from here. So let's right click, view this in the browser, and we have our drop down with our different options. Let's go ahead and open up the developer tools console, and let's make sure that we're selecting an item here. So when I click plus visualization, customer orders, I'm not actually seeing anything. And why is that? Because I didn't do a console.log. So anyway, let's hit continue. And what's going to happen here is when I click load data and I make a grid, let's change this to a grid, drag customer ID, we only get blonde P. And if I go back here and I do a console.log, and let's do selected value, we will see this change as we change, or as we create visualization. So I'll close this out, discard. Let's do a quick refresh, slide this over a bit, and we will, do a quick refresh. And I will select a customer here like Arut. We'll hit plus visualization. You can see Arut is going back. Let's pass this parameter to the server. We'll hit continue. My preview data comes up. I only see Arut. So it's that easy to pass headers to the server and to get just the data you need back for a particular user. So super easy and straightforward. Now, the last thing I want to show is how to configure a JSON data source on the client. So if you look again or remember again here, when I try to create a new visualization, and let's do just orders, I get this intermediate screen, and if I hit continue, I click continue again. So I kind of get this intermediate screen, but I want to avoid that intermediate screen. So how do I do that? Well, we give you the ability to pass a configuration to your JSON data source item. And this is all happening on the client. So again, 50-50 whether you want to use this or not. If it's on your intranet, probably fine. If it's out on your SaaS app, probably not the best idea. But I have my URL. I'm going out, getting the categories data, and creating a new JSON data source item. And I want to pass this configuration using the JSON schema config builder. So I'm going to add a numeric field, a string field, another numeric field, and then I'm going to pass it as a data source item in the array for the callback. So if I view this in the browser and I click plus visualization, and I'm going to select my data item here, sales by category, this dumps me right into the editor. I don't have that intermediate screen, so it's super easy to do this with a simple configuration. And just use at your own risk, because of course, if you're doing everything on the client, like passing URLs and all that, it could be a little risky, and just ensure that you're responsible for whatever secure infrastructure you're trying to deliver. So that's all I wanted to show you today. Super easy to do a configuration like so. super easy to pass a header. So with that, let's head back over to the slides. We're also going to pop up the poll, so please start answering that poll as we wrap up. Okay, so there you have it. It was pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Hopefully you have an idea now of how quickly you can get up and running. Like, we did a lot of just kind of real-time in-place coding there to really just get to a dashboard, which wasn't a lot. There was not a lot of work to make this happen. So if you have endpoints and you want to try out Reveal, look at how easy that was today. And even if you want to do it 100% client-side with either REST or JSON, you can just use the URL property of those data sources and do everything 100% client-side, which will just give you a feel for how Reveal can work in your environment. So if you have more questions or you want to get a deeper dive demo, check out revealbi.io. Email us at sales@revealbi.io. Or email myself or Casey, and we are always happy to answer any of your questions. We will stay on for a couple more minutes to make sure all of the questions are answered here, and please answer the poll questions as you're going through or as we're wrapping up the webinar here. Those poll questions are really important because your input is how we know what to do with the product in the future. All of our features are based on your feedback, and I showed you those resources today on GitHub. I showed you where you can add your own issues to GitHub, so please take a look at that, and that's really where we need your feedback along with this polling information to deliver the best product that we possibly can for you and ultimately your customers. So thanks again, everyone. We'll stay on a couple more minutes, but we appreciate your time. We know it's very valuable. You have a lot of options, and we will see you at the next webinar.